Alright guys, this could be a video response to CardinalVirtues on the Assange Sweden stuff. He made a long video, and thank God you did, Rob. I don't know what I'd do without you, seriously. I just can't get a boner for all these other YouTube debates, and I already told you this. You know, who cares if babies are atheists? Technically they can't be, because they lack an ability to believe and therefore lack an ability to not believe. But they don't believe in God. That's the point he's trying to make. I don't care. See, these debates are so fucking boring, but Rob, you come and save me every time. I do appreciate your presence. Unfortunately, you are self-confessed Sith, so you're on the wrong side of history. You will be on the wrong side of history with the kind of shit you spout. But I'm really glad for your presence. So let's get cracking. I was going to save this for later, but I think I'll put it right at the top of the video so that people understand this is a really central issue to it. What Rob and lots of other people that are arguing against Assange, broadly speaking, in this issue, they will, cite the European arrest warrant, cite the points of law within that, and quite often they will read out the justifications from the Swedish prosecution as if that's the end of the debate. Oh, the prosecution says this. Okay, we don't need to ask any questions. That's not good enough. But it's also not good enough to just simply state verbatim law from the European arrest warrant. That is a it's a recently updated set of laws that has come in for a lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism. It's been judged that by a lot of people, professionals in the in politics, in law, that it is an unfair system. That the updates have made it unfair. There's a group called Fair Trials, link in the lower bar to everything that I talk about in this video. And they are currently campaigning for a reform to the European arrest warrant. They argue that although it was brought in initially to try and help the transfer of individuals to make that easier for the war on terror, this is usually used for terrorists, that kind of thing, it's actually become something that's been quite easily abused, because under the reforms of the European arrest warrant, the accusing state does not need to give reasoning for the accusation. They just need to put in a European arrest warrant, and that's it. It requires you to assume that the law is infallible, or the accusations are infallible. It requires no proof of the allegations. It requires no rationale to be given in the official arrest warrant. It just needs to state that someone is accused of whatever crime. But fair trials are not alone. There are lots of people pushing for reform to the European arrest warrant system. And this is completely separate to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. So, just to quote verbatim from the European arrest warrant, it's not good enough. I'm sure I don't have to reel off a list of faulty or downright unjust law that you would disagree with, Rob. I'm sure I don't have to do that. So can you understand then that it's not enough for you to simply cite the provisions of the European arrest warrant? Part of the criticism is being made is that itself is an unjust set of updates to that system. Anyway, so with that said, again, sorry if there's any repetition from the previous video that I've done. If you've seen that, this is a response to Rob, and just going to try and answer some of the things that he said in his video. So there'll probably be some repetition from the last video, but hopefully I'll get some new stuff out there as well. Right, so first of all, I have to give him credit. He does state that he openly is not a fan of Manning, of WikiLeaks, and of Bradley Manning and Julian Assange. So he does give full disclosure, and I give you credit for that, Rob. There's other people on your side of the fence that are not so forthcoming with their agenda. But that's no small admission, Rob, because if you place yourself in opposition to Bradley Manning, you also place yourself in opposition to Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, of course, which lifted the lid on the true story of Vietnam, which remains one of the US's biggest shames. Ellsberg has been an ardent supporter of Manning, and he himself has said that Manning is his modern equivalent. So it's no small admission to state that, but I'm glad that you do that, because at least we know where you stand there, we know you're coming from. I'm not going to go into too much detail about, I'm not going to respond to the ad homs that litter Rob's video, but it is pertinent to note that he declares most WikiLeaks supporters liars, either liars or idiots duped by liars. But you have to remember that it's not just a bunch of enthusiastic people on the internet talking about it. No, that bunch of liars or idiots duped by liars includes Daniel Ellsberg, Thomas Drake, former NSA official who blew the whistle on massive corruption in surveillance industry with warrantless wiretapping. The US tried to indict him as well, but case completely collapsed. They didn't have a leg to stand on. Also included in that list of idiots or liars is Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst for 25 years, Craig Murray, an ex-UK ambassador, film director Ken Loach, journalist and filmmaker John Pilger, Michael Moore, Noam Chomsky, Oliver Stone, Vivienne Westwood, renowned feminist Helena Bergman, professors, lawyers and academics and intellectuals from all walks of life whose names you probably wouldn't be able to ascribe some level of credibility to, but that's just to give a small number of the people that support WikiLeaks, support Manning and Assange in this instance as well. So you can't just write off the support as liars and idiots. Sorry. You can do better than that, Rob. Come on. You know that there's more substance to the support than that. You in your video, you do a lot of reading from the prosecution's rationale and reasoning. A lot of it is completely vacuous, and I'll try and explain why. But don't you understand that that's not quite good enough? Just to read the prosecution's argument and then that's it. That's the end of the argument. That's how you read it in your video. Is that, well, they say this and that's it. What else do you want to know? Not good enough. Anyway, getting to the point. First of all, you said that Assange has not been charged and that under Swedish law, the decision to charge someone with a crime doesn't happen until much later down the line. That doesn't actually change a thing. They could do the interview here. There is precedent to do that. They haven't given sufficient reason why not. It basically has come down to something called Swedish prestige, which basically just means we look like pricks if we don't do it in Sweden. Well, first of all, it doesn't really that shows that your priorities are not with the accusers. Surely the only real reason to want to get this done quickly as possible is so that the accusers don't have to go through a long period of this uncomfortable waiting or distress. But that's not their agenda. I haven't seen that mentioned by the prosecution or Sweden once. It's about Swedish prestige, and they've just given really empty reasoning for why they can't do it in Sweden. We'll get to those specifically in a bit. But the fact that Sweden don't charge someone until later down the line doesn't change a thing. They did go to interview someone in Serbia, an accused murderer. Sweden sent someone to interview an accused murderer in Serbia. There'll be a link in the article on that to the low bar. And after that interview, they can make a decision about whether or not to charge. He doesn't have to be in Sweden for them to make that decision about whether or not to charge after the preliminary interview. That's not a stipulation. There's no legal barrier to doing those interviews here, somewhere neutral, and then taking the decision to charge. It changes nothing. You did say that they rejected the suggestion to do a video conference call because they thought it had to be done in person. And you accept that. That's it. That's enough for you, is it? That they said we have to do it in person. Why? For what reason does it need to be done in person? But that's not the end of it, is it? Because Assange didn't only offer to do it via video call, he's offered to do it in person as well. In fact, he offered to do it in Sweden on a couple of different dates. Those dates were rejected by the prosecution. This goes back to late last year. Or was it 2010? I'll get to those. It must have been 2010. I'll get to those shortly. But Assange has offered to meet in person several times, and they've rejected all of them for reasons such as a police officer being ill, a date being too far away, which is ironic, isn't it? They seem to be desperate to try and get this done as soon as possible on their terms, and yet they rejected a date on the basis that it was too far away. That was, I think, in October 2010. Right, yeah. So then you said that the arrest warrant was issued because Assange was accused of probable cause of the offences outlined on the EAW. So that's not any kind of reasoning, that's just describing the process of the EAW. And again, the EAW itself is coming under a lot of criticism, and not just from the supporters of WikiLeaks and Assange, but from fairtrials.org and lots of other organisations and professionals and lawyers and legal professionals that have stated on the record lots of problems with the European arrest warrant revisions. So the system itself is faulty, and it's been proven to be so. That's not just coming from Assange supporters, okay? So you can't just read out, the process of the European arrest warrant and think that that's the end of the argument. Let me outline some of the specific problems there with that. Mr. Hurtig, Assange's lawyer, has made numerous requests for further disclosure under the Swedish Criminal Procedures Code, Chapter 23, Paragraph 18, but these have been denied. In correspondence with the Australian Embassy in Stockholm, Ms. Nye justifies her position in refusing to disclose this important material on the grounds that Julian has not yet been charged. This highlights the injustice of the European arrest system, arrest warrant system. Julian has been held in solitary confinement and is now under effective house arrest without the Swedish prosecutor having to show a reasonable case against him, or indeed any of the evidence against him, to the British courts. So this is how easy it is to legitimise an extradition under this treaty. You don't even have to show evidence to the courts that you're requesting to put this through on. And you don't have to give evidence or details to the accused either. And you can apparently put people under effective house arrest without having to show a reasonable case against him. So, the strength or weakness of the allegations, or even their detail, cannot be heard in a European arrest warrant case. This is one of the central complaints made by law reformers about the EAW process, a civil liberties disaster and the subject of investigation and campaigns by human rights groups such as Fair Trials International, which I've already mentioned. It must be remembered that under the European arrest warrant system, the British courts are bound to regard the prosecutions of no less than 26 countries, including Poland and Romania, as perfect. The Extradition Act 2003 allows European countries to deem prosecutors and even policemen as judicial authorities. So there's another problem with it, and this is a question that came up about the initial request for the extradition. And the European arrest warrant was made by a private prosecutor. To give private prosecutors and policemen the status of judicial authority is a contradiction in terms, because they are neither independent nor impartial. Are they? So there's a problem there with it as well. And to demand return of their suspects from the UK so long as they tick the right box on the EAW form. In Julian's case, for example, they ticked rape on the court, and the courts cannot dispute that the allegation is of rape, even though the leading authority on sexual offences, the Oxford Professor Andrew Ashworth, disputes this characterisation. There can be no questioning on the merits of the charges. In 2003, Parliament abolished the traditional right of a suspect to require foreign governments to show prima facie case before dragging them off onto unfair trials. It also took away the historic right of the individual facing extradition to show that the case against them was unfounded. So they've taken provisions away from the accused. They've put more powers in the hands of completely people who can't be judged to be impartial to issue those requests. They're not questioned. It's a faulty system. I think I've done enough on that anyway. So I did say I didn't want to bore you, Rob, and apologise if that's kind of backfiring so far. Let's get to some good stuff, right? Because I know it's a really laboured subject when you get into the details of it. They said that this is reading from the prosecution's court records, whatever. It says mutual legal assistance is not an appropriate option in Assange's case. The preliminary investigation is at an advanced stage, and I consider it essential to interview Assange in person. For what reason? That's an empty statement. The preliminary, and the irony of the statement, the preliminary investigation is at an advanced stage. Preliminary investigation at an advanced stage. That sounds like a bit of a contradiction. Maybe it's not. But then she says, and I consider it essential to interview Assange in person. For what reason? There is none given. So there is no legal binding here that she has to do it in person in Sweden. There's no legal binding there. She just considers it essential. She hasn't cited some law. No specific law has been cited that Sweden has to do it in Sweden, okay? let's not gloss over that fact. This is a choice made by the prosecution. They would they consider it essential to do it in person in Sweden. Actually, the quote that you read out didn't say it in person in Sweden, it just said in person. And again, Assange has offered to be interviewed in person several times. The offer has been open constantly, actually, for the duration of his house arrest. They refuse not to do that, and they don't give a reason why they won't. Now, Rob, I know you're not stupid, which is why I you know what's going on. You know what's going on. You know the agendas here. You know how things work. You probably know more about global politics than I do in terms of being able to cite specific, events and things like that. But so you know all this, and yet you seem completely blind to really obvious things here and criticisms of procedures, law, and you aren't you aren't questioning at all the rationale of the prosecution here. You just read out their empty statements as if that's enough. Disappointing. The upshot of all this that you were saying is you basically trying to imply that Assange is dodging questioning, and that's a line of critique that a lot of people on your side of the fence are coming with. You're basically trying to imply that Assange is dodging questioning. Because you said that Hertig, I didn't really get what you were saying with this, but you said that Hertig, Assange's lawyer, first claimed apparently that no one tried to question him in Sweden, then later admitted that they did. And if you're trying to cast dispersions on, again, Assange's willingness to be questioned, but there's a lot of context from that early part of the investigation that you don't mention. Miss Nye, the prosecution, had no objection to Assange leaving the country. He didn't flee the country to avoid interrogation. He offered to return to Sweden on the 9th to the 10th of October for interrogation. This date was rejected as being too far away. That's the one that I mentioned before. And the prosecution also rejected a proposed interview date because one of the police associated with the case was ill. Both seem like really weak reasons for rejecting those offers of a in-person interview that Assange gave. If there's anybody that's been prolonging this situation, it's been the Swedish prosecution. They're the ones denying provisions that they could accept. They're the ones refusing to have meetings when they could choose to do that, when there is no legal barrier for them to do so. Okay? Don't you think that's an important context? Right. I don't want to do any repetition here, so I'm just going to see what the next bit is. I won't be able to edit. I'm still using a Mac and I just have no idea how to edit on it, so sorry for that. So yeah, I think you said that they need him there before they can indict him. Again, that doesn't match up to precedent. Again, they have sent prosecutors to Serbia to interview an accused murderer. So I don't see why this is any different. I mean, not to diminish the severity of sexual assault, but I think of the type that's been mentioned here, surely is not as severe as murder. So why were they able to go there and not to Assange? Because it's political. We'll get to that in a bit. You said that you kind of said that you kind of mocked the idea that it's sinister intent because they'd sent cops to the embassy. you said protesters defended the embassy, and you think that was a pretty stupid argument. You said the UK could take protesters if they wanted to, and that wouldn't be an issue. Physically, maybe they could take protesters, yeah, but legally, the situation there's a lot of legal and diplomatic barriers to carrying out what they quite obviously wanted to do. So I don't think you can just write it off as a stupid argument. I think it's quite possible that the protesters did defend the embassy that night by making sure that the world's eyes was on it. Why send? How many vans was it? Was it 6 vans? 6 vans full of police, loads of police on the street, a helicopter cordoned off areas. Why would you do all that if you weren't going up the fire escapes? And all this, so you didn't want him to escape? Okay. You say that's because you didn't want him to escape, right? You really think that's going to happen? During house arrest, the guy, well, first of all, he offered himself to Swedish authorities initially. He also offered himself to the British authorities when he arrived back in Britain. He willingly went along with the tag system on house arrest, checked into police station every day. His whereabouts have been known ever since these allegations were put on him. And he's been cooperative at every stage, up until the point where it seemed like the Swedish authorities were being unreasonable, and even then he's given, he's offering to be cooperative under fair and neutral terms. But so to say that you think he's going to escape, one of the most recognised faces in the world in the centre of London with CCTV cameras everywhere and hundreds of police, watching him, and do you really, really think, Rob, that he was going to try and escape? It's not going to make him look good, is it? It's not going to help his case, So I'd say you need to give that a bit more significance than you give it. The level of response was completely disproportionate for a guy that effectively wanted for skipping bail. At least, in Britain, that's his only misdemeanor here is skipping bail. You think that's just a proportionate response, do you? You think that money's well spent? You don't think those coppers could be, more useful elsewhere in the city of London? I don't think you can write it off as a stupid argument. Then you said, police send police to where a fugitive is not a big story. In and of itself, maybe not. 1 or 2 coppers, maybe even a van full of coppers, not a big story. But 6 vans, a whole street's worth, a helicopter. I think you have to take into context the proportionality of the response when you make a judgment on whether or not that was, a big story. Then you said something that was amazing. You said it would be illegal for the UK to let him leave. Then explain General Pinochet. Yeah? When Pinochet was being detained in London on a Spanish arrest warrant, the UK government was unable to fulfil its extradition obligations. General Pinochet was arrested in London in 1998 at the request of a Spanish judge who sought to put him on trial for human rights abuses alleged to have happened during his 17-year rule in Chile. Now, full disclosure, that was in 2001. This was before the revisions to the European arrest warrant. But the fact remains that with General Pinochet, the UK was unable to fulfil its extradition obligations because they saw a higher law took precedent, and that was of political asylum, which was enabled by diplomatic immunity, which is one of the most fundamental cornerstones of diplomacy, one of the most significant achievements of the modern age. It allows things like a US embassy in China to house a Chinese dissident without fear of China entering the building. Diplomatic immunity is huge, which is seen by the fact that you have a meeting of all the foreign ministers of South America almost unanimously supporting this decision and stating that they believe correctly that diplomatic immunity, political asylum by extension, trumps extradition law. Those are treaties that are written up by countries. Usually they have specific treaties with each country as well. it's not. It's diplomatic immunity and political asylum is a higher law. Okay, it trumps it. The Vienna Convention is the most subscribed to convention in existence, right? And it trumps the extradition treaty. So if you're really concerned about law, you need to recognize the hierarchy of the different legislations that we're talking about here. Okay, so Vienna Convention trumps your extradition treaty, which has got a hell of a lot of problems since the updates to it, as I've laid out some of them. Now, then you said that, you kind of mocked this idea that the US is pulling strings. You said there's no direct evidence. You said you conceded that there could be, but there's no direct evidence. I mean, you might reject all of these things, but I'm going to give you some direct evidence. The grand jury, the fact that the grand jury is happening itself, obviously proves that they are working towards generating an indictment. Although, cables released from an Australian embassy suggest that a sealed indictment already exists, and they're just waiting for the right time that it's easier for them to action that. That was from a diplomatic cable from the Australian embassy for Cablegate. So either you think Australian diplomats are lying, or you have to concede that there is inside information to suggest a sealed indictment already exists. But regardless of that, the grand jury is in process, has been in process. You said yourself, of course, that is with a view to, generating an indictment. So why does that indictment already have to exist for that to be a concern? Why isn't the process to generate the justification for an indictment enough? I mean, you split hairs over things like the Swedish don't charge until late down the procedure. You hold that up as some kind of significant point, and I think I've shown that it's irrelevant. But you consider that to be significant, and yet you don't see the significance of the process to create an indictment. You don't consider that enough to be direct evidence of an indictment forthcoming. I can't get my head around that. I must be missing something there, Rob. Please put me right on that one. And you kind of mocked it though. You said that this idea that we're just trying to railroad Assange, which it's interesting that you use that term railroad, because that is how one of the accusers described feeling after a case for assault was opened, after she simply wanted to seek a way to compel Assange to get an STD test. I can't remember which one of them, but yeah, one of the accused is quoted as saying that she felt railroaded after simply going to try and find a way to compel Assange to get an STD test, and it was opened as an assault charge. In fact, she has refused to sign the first initial statement that she gave when she went into the police station, and you can look that up. She's not signed that. She refused to do so. She said she felt railroaded. That's just an irony of the of your choice of word there, but I think that was an important, it's an interesting, important little piece of information to put in there. So anyway, evidence for US indictment, the grand jury itself. Also, attempts by US prosecutors to inculpate. I'm reading from some quotes that I've got here. What's inculpate? Basically, attempts by US prosecutors to paint Assange as a co-conspirator in the Manning case. Now, this is essential for them if they want to get him on charges of espionage, because they need to establish a link between Assange and Manning directly in order to charge him on, to say that he's been a conspirator, basically. So I'd say that is some evidence too. And these leaks from the Australian cables, that was February 28th, 2012. Or is that the article I'm reading from? My notes aren't that neat. Everything that I'm referring to being the low bar, so you can go and check it. Yeah, leaks published today from Stratfor, a private intelligence corporation, indicated that United States Department of Justice has issued a secret sealed indictment against Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks. So there's that as well, the leak from Stratfor. And the fact that WikiLeaks supporters have had their Twitter account opened up by secret orders. WikiLeaks supporters have had their stuff, taken out, confiscated at airports, this kind of thing. The US is going after WikiLeaks and its supporters in unprecedented ways. The financial blockade that came after influence from the States Department. Is none of that evidence for you that an indictment either exists or is being formulated right now? You mentioned the grand jury yourself is a process to decide whether there's enough to indict him. Why are you making the distinction between that and then having it actually in their hand, right now, ready to officially issue it? I don't understand why you're making that distinction when it comes to questions of political asylum. You are assessing the possibility that you will be, targeted for your political positions and activity. You said that Sweden wouldn't be allowed to send him to a country with a death penalty. Well, the European Court of Human Rights was unable to prevent the torture of the asylum seekers Ahmed Hussein Mustafa Kamil Agiza, who was extradited to US custody in violation of international treaties. You also mentioned yourself the 2 Egyptian guys that were sent there. And you kind of wrote that off as, will Sweden flub the law or not? Who knows? Let's see what happens. I don't think that's good enough, Rob. You can't just say, let's see if they will or not. Let's see if Sweden will follow the law. No, because then it would be too late, won't it? No. We're making the argument now that they will flub the law and basing that on their track record and the inconsistencies with their prosecution, the problems with the EAW, the many incidents of them, acquiescing to US demands, unsavoury demands. So these arguments are there. So it's not good enough to just say, let's see what happens. Maybe Sweden will flub the law, maybe they won't. It's not good enough. And then you said you kind of mocked this idea that they're not going to, the US wouldn't give him his duly rights. Well, I could spend the next 3 hours pointing to incidents of the US not giving detainees their duly rights, but especially political ones. But you just have to look at Manning. He's been detained for over 800 days. The legal limit is 120. He's been kept under conditions that have been, described as amounting to torture by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. So I think that's a pretty solid argument before you can get to all the other things you could mention about the US not giving due rights to political dissidents and prisoners in general. So I don't think you can mock that so easily, Rob. Let's have a look. Yeah, when you said there's nothing sinister about it, nothing sinister about a grand jury. Don't you think that maybe the act of actually attempting to criminalise a media organisation for doing what media have always done, which is print, information of interest to the public, don't you think that's a bit sinister to be trying to criminalise that? WikiLeaks is an organisation that's been open for several years now, and before Assange came out as a figurehead, before the big leaks came out, they were operating for several years already, over 200 legal challenges, never convicted of a single crime. Because it is not illegal to print information of interest to the public. There's a very narrow band of types of information that are prohibited, and that is things like nuclear launch codes, secret service identities. So there's a very narrow band there, and that comes under the Espionage Act, which I'm sure only applies to US citizens. How can you really accuse a foreign national of espionage? Maybe I'm wrong on that, but still, very small band of information that can be classified as illegal to release. WikiLeaks has won every single case ever brought against it, so I think that's a bit sinister that the US would even try to criminalise a media organisation. They're just embarrassed, that's it. Sorry, it wasn't illegal. You are just a bit butthurt. Not you, US government. And the UK government, indeed, as well. They've got quite almost an equal reasoning for wanting to subdue this guy. The UK was embarrassed too. The storing of illegal cluster bombs, for one. I mean, there's lots and lots of heinous shit that came out about the UK as well. And you've made this argument before that Assange just picks on the US. That's not true at all. Hundreds of different countries have had information printed about their authorities and governments that they wouldn't want to be out there. This is a really important bit because, Rob, you said in your video that an argument from WikiLeaks and Assange supporters is that it's easier to extradite from Sweden than it is from the UK, but that no evidence is ever put forward as to why that is. You said just give me one reason. I'm going to give you 7 reasons. So you think that no one has ever given a reason as to why it's easier to extradite from Sweden than it is from the UK. You think no one's given any evidence of that. I'm going to give you 7 reasons. Let's see if you accept any of these. First of all, the UK has stringent appeal procedures. Sweden does not. That would put a spanner in the works. The appeal procedures are a lot stronger in this country. Second, Sweden has extradited 2 Egyptian nationals to face torture, as you said yourself. So, bad track record there. That was after pressure from the US as well. Number 3, public opinion in the UK is stronger in favour of WikiLeaks. So, public opinion is certainly another spanner in the works. If that request came through to the UK, there'd be a lot more opposition to it here. And even though most of the media here is quite critical, there is certainly more supportive media here than there is in Sweden, which has a notoriously under-the-thumb media, or rather interconnected media that I've been reading about recently. But anyway, more public opinion support in the UK. Number 4, Sweden has no system of bail, so Assange will be held incommunicado till his trial, so he wouldn't be able to effectively seek protection were the extradition request to come in from the US then. He'd be held incommunicado in a jail cell without any bail. Number 5. You said that permission from the UK would be needed if he was in Sweden anyway, but I don't think that's going to be an issue based on what we've heard from William Hague. I really don't think the UK government would hesitate for a second to give that permission. So that's a bit of a non-starter. Number 6. As I've said before, the European Court of Human Rights was unable to prevent the torture of the asylum seeker Ahmed Hussein Mustafa Kamil Agiza, who's extradited to US custody in violation of international treaties. So that's another example. That's not the Egyptian ones. Number 7, and this is probably the biggest one. The clause in Swedish law, or the Swedish extradition treaty between the US and Sweden, the clause of temporary surrender or conditional release. Let me read a paragraph from a US embassy cable, Panama cable, about conditional release. Use of conditional release, under which the government of Panama releases to the US a suspect already under arrest in Panama on other charges. Under this procedure, the suspect is lent to the US for prosecution on the condition that they will be returned for prosecution in Panama at the end of their sentence. This procedure is much faster than a formal extradition and has been proven so successful that sometimes they design operations to bring suspects to Panama so they can be arrested in Panama and turned over to the US authorities quickly. But I think a bit more on that. Yeah, so this idea of conditional release is a clause in the extradition treaty between Sweden and the UK. That clause is not in the extradition treaty between the US and the UK. It is only in the one between the US and Sweden. So they might not even have to do an official extradition request. They could use the clause of temporary surrender and say that Sweden can have him back after the US have finished with him under this clause. And that's not been reported on widely. Again, links to all of this in the low bar. So there's 7 reasons why it would be easier to extradite from Sweden than it would be from the UK. UK stringent appeal processes, the fact that Sweden's got a bad track record with the Egyptian nationals, No system of bail in Sweden. UK would easily give permission, so that's a non-starter. Ahmed Hussein Agiza, who's extradited to the US, another black mark on Sweden's record, and the temporary surrender conditional release clause. So I hope you accept at least a few of them, Rob. Then you said, typically, if the death penalty is on the table, these countries would not extradite unless the US guarantees that they will not receive the death penalty. I find it almost endearing that you acquiesce so easily to, the empty promises of the governments in question here, especially when you yourself have cited, incidents of both countries breaking those international treaties and laws. What else have we got here? Yeah, then you had some slurs on Ecuador. I mean, really irrelevant to this. In this instance, yes, they are a champion for free speech and human rights. You can mention, incidents of them failing to live up to those standards in the past. You mischaracterise them, I think, a little bit. I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but you wouldn't win that argument. The US and the UK have a far worse human rights record than Ecuador, when you take into account the human rights, violations and atrocities perpetrated outside our own borders, and some inside the borders too. But you're not going to win that argument. But it's irrelevant anyway, because we're talking about this situation. So you can try and slur the reputation of Ecuador as a country in the past. Doesn't have any relevance to this situation. Sorry. Yeah, you mentioned Pussy Riot at the end there quickly. I just want to say that Assange mentioned it too. So this is one example of, kind of flies in the face of your allegation that Assange only picks on America, basically. He did criticise Russia and stuck up for Pussy Riot recently. He's also, again, released leaks that are critical of countries around the world, and that was going on for a good 4 years before the big US leaks even started. So there's no adverse agenda there. And I should remind you that as a media organisation, as a leaking exercise, WikiLeaks are reliant on insiders coming to them. So they don't dictate which countries they go after. They are recipient to information from insiders of governments and organisations. Okay, so they're completely reliant on that. So if you want to say that Assange is picking on the US, I think you need to. It would be more of an accurate statement to say that recently there's been more US whistleblowers coming to WikiLeaks than there has been in the past, or than other countries. But also the fact that the US has the most reach in the world. It is the most powerful country in the world. It is responsible for the most human rights violations in total, and we can make a whole new argument about that. But there's no undue bias there. Okay. I think just quickly I wanted to mention as well that I think it's a bit of a... I think when you put so much emphasis on this assumption that Sweden would not be allowed to send to countries with a death penalty, although we've seen them have a bad record in the past of going against those provisions, it's not just the death penalty that we're worried about here. And it's not even just torture that we're worried about here as well. Life imprisonment or even long-term imprisonment is enough reason for someone to seek political asylum. They don't have to be only up against the death penalty to seek political asylum, and that has been given. He's now officially a political refugee. Whether you agree with it or not, that country's been taken by a sovereign diplomatic state, okay, and supported by the majority of South America. And you can't just write that off as bias, okay. So yeah, it's not just the death penalty that's the worry here, and that doesn't have to be the only threat in order for political asylum to be legitimately given. But should really just close with reiterating the point that I made at the start of the video, and that is that the Vienna Convention, diplomatic immunity, and by extension political asylum trumps these extradition laws, especially given the 2003 updates that have come in for so much criticism. Okay, so you can't just read out the extradition laws and think that that's it. There is a higher law, and that is the Vienna Convention. the most subscribed convention in the world. Okay, diplomatic immunity has been the most significant, one of the most significant achievements of the world to have that, you know, in place, and to have these embassies inviolable throughout the world, no matter what the conditions. And William Hague's reaction was completely disproportionate and absolute embarrassment to the country, and did smack of desperation. And I know you agree that that would have been a ridiculous thing to do, but if you make that observation, if you concede that that would have been a gross overreaction, that would have been a stupid thing to do, shouldn't you then realise that that is politicised? The scale of the reaction and the threats given over this relatively minor incident, or issue rather, whatever. The scale of the disproportionate reaction is reason enough to show that it's politicised. There's many other reasons. Some of them I've gone over in this video, and I'm going to stop here because I don't want to bore people too much, although it's probably too late for that. So yeah. I'm going down to the Ecuadorian embassy on Thursday in London, so if anybody wants to meet up, I shall be down there, and support and that, and yeah, see us down there. Give us a message if you want to meet up, and we'll sort something out. Yeah, alright guys, bye bye.